Do you ever stop and think about the design of the clear aligners you're using? I know most of us, we pick an aligner system that we want to use, we send the case, and we never really think of the specifics of the tray design, especially the trim line. It is how it is. The lab cuts it however they cut it. The patient wears the tray and we move on with our lives. But here's something that I've been thinking a lot about lately. If you look at the published biomechanical research over the last 13 years, the trim line might be the most clinically significant design decision in the entire aligner. And most of us aren't actively choosing it. The lab or the company is choosing it for us. And of course, there are conflicting claims between different aligner companies. So I want to do something specific in this video. I want to walk you through every major study on trim line design in chronological order, starting with the landmark paper that started this whole conversation back in 2012 and ending with a 2025 finite element study that just flipped a piece of conventional wisdom on its head. By the end of this video, you're going to walk away with three things. One, the actual force numbers and effect sizes from each study so you can speak to this with confidence. Two, the specific clinical scenario where the old scalloped cut might actually outperform the high trim line. And three, the one question this entire body of research still hasn't answered, even though it directly affects every patient you treat. So let's get into it. So we start off in 2012 with a paper out of UNLV by Daniel Cowley, James Mah, and Mah O'Toole. And this was published in the Journal of Clinical Orthodontics. Now, as a side note, the JCO is one of my favorite journals to read on a regular basis. So if you geek out on orthodontics, that's the one I would recommend. But this is a foundational paper. Everything else in this video traces back to here. So here's the design. They thermoformed aligners onto a Kilgore typodont and compared three trim configurations. They had a scalloped cut, a straight line cut right at the gingival zenith, and a straight cut 2 millimeters above the zenith. Then they ran it twice across two different materials. They used Invisacryl A and Invisacryl C. And then twice again with or without first premolar attachments. That gave them 12 test groups, 3 aligners each, pulled off the model 10 times a piece, and they used this machine. It's a universal testing machine. So they used this for a total of 360 pull-offs. So the results were pretty dramatic. With attachments and Invisacryl A material, the scallop design averaged 5.985 pounds of retention. But the straight cut that was cut at the zenith was 15.571 pounds. And then the straight cut 2 millimeters above the zenith, that was a whopping 22.122 pounds. So that is a 3.7x jump from the scallop to the high straight in the same material on the same model. Now also note that if your aligner company uses a straight cut and says it's 4 times more retentive, this is probably what they're referring to. Straight extended trim plus attachments plus the right material, that combination was the most retentive aligner configuration they tested, and not by a little, by almost 4 times the retention of the scalloped equivalent. So if you're treating a case where retention matters, such as torquing movements, translations, difficult rotations, or even dealing with short clinical crowns, this is the configuration that the original biomechanical evidence points to. Next, I'm going to show you figure 3, and this bar chart shows all 12 groups with their retention values. But here's the thing that should really stop you. Scalloped margins with attachments were significantly less retentive than the scalloped margins without attachments. And the authors explain why. So when the aligner is flexible enough at the margin, it bows away from the natural tooth undercuts as it passes over the attachments. So you're almost like fighting your own attachment. So that's a line that should make every aligner clinician kind of reconsider. We add attachments, think we're adding retention, but with a scalloped trim, the data shows you might be doing the opposite. Now, my personal bet is that the attachment placement and the tooth size matters here. If you have a longer tooth and the attachment is placed further away from the gingiva, then you probably won't see that as much, but that's just my personal opinion. So this is the paper that started the field. So 13 years later, we have ClearCorrect, SureSmile, Candid Pro, GC Move, and all have moved towards a flat or extended trim design, or at least give it as an option, and this paper is why. Now, quick aside on the materials, because I know some of you are wondering. So Invisacril A is a copolyester, so it's the same family as Essex-A+, and it was adjacent to Invisalign's polyurethane that was used at the time of this study. Most aligners you prescribe today fall in or near this category. Now, multi-layer materials like Zendura Flex, which I'm a fan of, weren't part of this 2012 study. Those came later and behaved differently, with lower peak force but better force retention over time. So when we talk about the numbers here, we're talking about single layer copolyester behavior. Fast forward 10 years to 2022. Tarek Elshazly and his team at the University of Bonn, working with researchers from the Institute Straumann in Basel, publish in the Journal of Dentistry. And I want to flag the Straumann thing right here at top, because Straumann bought ClearCorrect in 2017. And so I think it's just important to be clear about that for intellectual honesty. And ClearCorrect, I believe, uses a straight extended trim. So know your conflicts. But the methodology here is rigorous enough that the findings are now cited in pretty much every subsequent paper in the field. So here I'm going to throw up a picture of the four different trim lines that they used. So they thermoformed 36 aligners, and this is interesting for those who love Zendura Flex like I do, because that's what they use. They use 0.75 millimeter Zendura Flex sheets, 9 aligners per group, 4 groups, scalloped, scalloped extended, straight, and straight extended. So then they set up 3D printed maxilla where tooth number 11, or UR1, or for you lovers of the Freedom units here in the States, tooth number 8, so the upper right central incisor, and it was bodily translated 0.2 millimeters to the facial. So the aligner is trying to push that tooth back. So the question is, where does the force actually land on the tooth? So to measure that, they used Fuji Prescale pressure sensitive films. And so these are color changing films that go between the aligner and the tooth and create a heat map of exactly where pressure is applied. So they divided the facial surface into 7 zones. We had cervical, middle, incisal, and then the 4 corners. And they recorded the force in each zone. And so here are the heat map results. The mean active force across the entire tooth was 3.8 newtons for the scallop design and 5.6 newtons for the straight extended. So that's about a 47% increase, which is statistically significant. But the overall numbers kind of undersell what's actually happening here. So look at this image. The scalloped on the upper left and the straight extended on the bottom right. With the scallop design, the cervical third of the tooth is essentially dark, meaning almost no force is being transmitted there. But with the straight extended design, the cervical zone lights up with pressure. And the numbers were significant. The cervical zone, scallop delivered 0.2 newtons of force, but the straight extended delivered 2.0 newtons of force. So that's a 10-fold difference. 10x, baby! And at the mid zone, scalloped was 0.1 newtons and straight extended was 3.2 newtons. So that's a 32-fold difference. So why does that matter clinically? Well, the center of resistance of an incisor sits in the root of the tooth. So to get bodily movement instead of tipping, you need the force application closer to the center of resistance, which means more force at the cervical zone. A scallop trim is structurally incapable of delivering that force in the cervical zone. The material is too thin and too flexible at the gingival margin. Now, one more thing worth your attention. They measured aligner thickness after thermoforming and found a 60 to 75% reduction across the tooth surface. So that 0.75 millimeters Endura Flex sheet becomes 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters aligner once it's on the tooth. So the thickness on the box is not the thickness you're delivering. So by 2022, the biomechanics story has started to crystallize. Straight extended wins on most force deliveries. Straight extended also wins on retention. So the clinical recommendation seems obvious. Cut your aligners high and flat, get better outcomes. But there's a question the biomechanics hasn't touched yet, and that is, what does this trim do to a patient's gums? In 2023, a research team out of the University of Padova in Italy, led by Riccardo Favero, published in the Dental Press Journal of Orthodontics. And they did something I really like methodologically, and that is they ran a split mouth study. So here are the designs of the trays. And what they did was they took 43 adolescents ages 14 to 18, class 1 malocclusion, mild to moderate upper crowding, and clean periodontal status at baseline. And then everyone got a 0.75 millimeters PETG aligners from Shoe Dental. So from baseline to 3 months, both quadrants on the upper arch were cut in a vestibular rim. So that's the trim extending about 3 millimeters above the gingival margin. So essentially a straight extended design. Then at month 3, they did something a little clever. They swapped the second quadrant to a juxtagingival rim, so a scalloped design following the gingival contour, while keeping the first quadrant in the vestibular rim. So each patient became their own control. So they tracked 3 periodontal indices. They tracked plaque index, gingival index, and gingival bleeding index at 3 different time points. So they checked at baseline, and in 3 months, and in 6 months. So here's what they found, and it might be the opposite of what your intuition tells you. The first quadrant, the extended vestibular rim, kept the entire study, showed no statistically significant changes in the periodontal index. So 6 months of wear, no worsening of plaque, no worsening of gingivitis, no increase in bleeding. At the second quadrant, same patient, same hygiene, same brushing, same diet, showed no changes while it was running the vestibular rim. But as soon as they switched to a juxtagingival, so the scallop trim design, at 3 months, everything got worse. Gingival index worsened significantly at the 3-month follow-up, and by month 6, every index was significantly worse. So plaque, gingivitis, and bleeding by 6 months. So the authors proposed 2 mechanisms here. First, the scalloped rim sits right at the gingival sulcus. So every time a patient takes the aligner off or snaps it back in, minimum of twice a day, but usually a lot more than that, that edge mechanism traumatizes the marginal gingiva. And the extended rim sits on attached keratinized gingiva that's biologically built to handle that kind of mechanical load. Second, they argue that the scallop rim actually pushes plaque into the sulcus during seeding, while the higher rim sits above the sulcus and doesn't disturb it. Now, this is the only published clinical study I'm aware of that directly compares trimline designs for periodontal outcome. Now, the sample size is small, it's adolescents only, 1 material, 1 manufacturer, but it's the cleanest piece of in vivo evidence we have. And it suggests something that pretty much flips the conventional comfort narrative on its head. The scallop design isn't actually gentler on the tissue, it may be worse. So now we have biomechanic evidence saying straight extended wins on force, and clinical evidence saying straight extended is also better for gum health. The next question is whether we can validate these findings with computational modeling, because if pressure films and clinical observations are pointing in the same direction, the finite element analysis should too, and that's exactly what the Bond group published just months later in the Journal of Mechanical Behavior of Biomedical Materials. So in February 2023, Elshazly and team, same group, same Strawman funding disclosure, published published in the Journal of Mechanical Behavior of Biomedical Materials. And their goal was to take their 2022 pressure film findings and validate them computationally with FEA. So here's the design. They built a 3D digital model of a maxillary central incisor with 0.2 millimeters of facial bodily malposition. So it's the same setup as the 2022 experiment. Then they modeled aligners at 4 trim designs and 4 thicknesses. So the thicknesses were 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, and 0.6 millimeters. So that gave them a total of 16 simulations. Now to get a little bit nerdy here, the software was Mark Mentant, the aligner was meshed at a 10-noded tetrahedral elements, and the force was 0.2 millimeters displacement that was applied to tooth number 11, or again here in the States, tooth number 8. Now the force increased super linearly with thickness, so a 0.6 millimeter aligner doesn't deliver twice the force of a 0.3 millimeter aligner. It delivers more than that because the aligner deformation is a combination of stretching, which scales linearly, and bending, which scales at the cube of the thickness. But here's the finding that's the real clinical pearl. The FEA captured something the pressure films couldn't see, and that was the aligner physically lifts off the tooth at the gingival edge during malposition. So the scalloped design showed the highest liftoff, and the straight extended showed the lowest, regardless of thickness. So this explains why. Scallop design isn't just thinner at the margin, it actively pulls away from the tooth at the gingival third under load. So you're not just losing force, you're losing contact entirely. And finally, the authors illustrate the biomechanical mechanism beautifully. With the straight extended trim, the cervical force counteracts the lingual force, generating a moment of couple that opposes the tipping moment of the incisal force. So that's how you get third order control. That's how you get bodily movement instead of crown tipping. So by mid-2023, we have experimental evidence and computational evidence from the same research group using the same model, both pointing to the same conclusion. Straight extended isn't just slightly better, it's mechanically the only design that creates reliable conditions for bodily tooth movement. Now, this is not to say you can't achieve these movements with scallop trays, but you're really going to have to utilize attachments, auxiliaries, and overcorrection to overcome the shortcomings of the scallop design. But here's where the story gets a little more interesting, because while Elshazly was validating his model against his own experiments, a separate research group at Sun Yat-sen University in China was doing something different. They were asking what happens when you combine trimline design with the other big variable that clinicians control, and that's material thickness. And their findings would complicate the straight extended story, but in a useful way. So up to this point, every study in this chronology has asked the same question with slight variations. Is straight better than scalloped? And the answer has consistently been yes. But in August 2023, that research group from Sun Yat-sen University in China asked a completely different question, and that was, should the answer be the same for every tooth? So here Doctors Liu and Tan published in the American Journal of Orthodontics and Dentofacial Orthopedics. And now this paper is dense, and I can't give you this one because I had to pay for it. This one is behind a paywall, so this one isn't open source, but I'll give you the link to where you can pay for it if you want to. But I'll tell you up front, this is one of the most rigorous studies we've covered yet, and the conclusion may change how you plan a case. So here's what they did. They took CBCT and intraoral scan data from a real patient, a 25-year-old female 4 bicuspid extraction case, and built a patient-specific maxilla, including the cortical bone, the cancellous bone, periodontal ligament, gingiva, and teeth. And unlike earlier FEA models, the PDL was modeled as viscoelastic, so not just a static spring. They ran tensile tests on actual Durand aligner materials at 2 thicknesses to get the real nonlinear stress strain curves. So this isn't a simplified textbook model. This is as close to in vivo as silica gets in 2023. So they built 12 aligners, 2 thicknesses. So they were at 0.75 millimeters and 0.5 millimeters, and 2 margin shapes, scalloped and straight, and 3 heights, -2 millimeters below, 0 millimeters at zenith, and +2 millimeters above. And then they simulated for en masse anterior retraction. So now the headline, they confirmed everything we already know. 0.75 millimeters beats 0.5 millimeters on force transmission. Straight beats scalloped on PDL stress. And trimming below the gingival margin is basically clinically useless because the force drops too far below for tooth movement. But then they measured what they called the RC ratio, which was the root displacement divided by crown displacement. And closer to 0 means more bodily movement and less tipping. And when they ranked every aligner design tooth by tooth, they found something nobody had reported before. For the central and lateral incisors, the best movement control came from a straight trim right above the gingival zenith. Not extended above it, but right at it. For canines, the best movement control came from scalloped trim at the zenith, scalloped at canines, and for the best molar control, that came from a straight extended. So what's interesting here is every tooth had a different optimum. So they built what they called the optimized aligner, Model 13, so combining all 3. Straight at the zenith for incisors, scalloped at the zenith for the canines, and straight extended at the molars. So that was one aligner, but with 3 different trim styles. And when they ran it against every uniform design aligner, the differential design won across every tooth in the arch. So this is the paper that, in my opinion, points where the field is going. The question may not be scalloped versus straight extended. The real question may be, what design does this specific tooth need to do this specific movement in this specific patient? So through 2023, most studies only tested a single tooth, which is usually the upper central incisor, and is almost always tooth number 11, or here in the States, tooth number 8. And every study had used one type of measurement device. But this changes in 2024, because that's when in April of 2024, Flavio Traversa, Felipe Chavanne, and James Mah, yes, the same James Mah from the 2012 paper that started all this, published in Orthodontics and Craniofacial Research. And so 12 years after Mah's foundational retention study, he's back, and this time using technology that just didn't exist in 2012. So the technology is called Orthodontic Force Simulator, or OFS for short. It's a custom-built device with 14 independent force torque sensors, 1 per tooth. It can measure 3-dimensional forces and moments at the center of resistance for every tooth in the arch simultaneously. So it's the same study, full disclosure, built by Institute Straumann. Now here's why this matters. Up to this point, every trimline study has tested the central incisor. Now here's why this matters. Up to this point, every trimline study has tested the central incisor. Traversa expanded that to 3 teeth, so the central incisor, the canine, and the first molar. And they also tested 3 movements: palatal translation, mesial translation, and intrusion. And they also tested 2 trim lines: flat at the gingival margin versus flat extended 2 millimeters above. So 18 total scenarios. So they used Straumann's clear quartz material, which for us EnduraFlex fans is a multi-layered thermoplastic. So the first headline is Anatomy Matters. For palatal translation at the extended trim, the central incisor required 7.68 newtons of force. The canine was 8.21 newtons and the molar was 11 newtons. So the molar needed 50% more force than incisors for the same movement. For mesial translation, the molar required nearly double the force of the incisor. That was 17 newtons versus only 9. The second headline is the trimline effect held up across the entire arch. The extended trim consistently delivered higher target force than the gingival zenith trim, while either maintaining or reducing unwanted side effects. So for canine palatal translation, the signal to noise ratio, that's the desired movements divided by the tipping movement, went from 0.9 in the straight cut versus up to 0.99 for the extended cut. So for molar intrusion, the ratio jumped from 2.55 to 3.12, which is a 22% improvement in movement quality. Now, this is the finding I want you to take home, and that is what happened to the neighboring teeth. For every single movement they tested, every one, the adjacent tooth showed compensatory force in the opposite direction of the intended movement, often up to half the magnitude of the target tooth's force. So when you move one tooth, the neighboring tooth pushes back up to 50% of the total force that's being applied to the target tooth, but in the wrong direction. So that's anchorage loss happening in real time. When you plan a canine retraction, the premolars aren't going to sit still. They're going to be pushed mesially at the same by the same aligner that's pulling the canine distally. This is the orthodontic equivalent to trying to push a couch across a carpet and the floor doesn't stay put. So the lesson from Traversa is this: trimline design isn't just about the tooth you're trying to move, it's about controlling the system. The extended trim controls the system better than the straight cut at the zenith on almost every tooth in the arch, across every translational movement tested. So through 2023, the picture had become genuinely complicated, right? We have 9 years of evidence saying straight extended generally wins for force delivery. We have Liu telling us that the answer should probably be tooth specific. We have Favero telling us the trim design also affects periodontal health. And we have Traversa telling us the trim line controls the whole system, not just one tooth. So the field was overdue for someone to take a step back and synthesize what we actually know. So in December of 2024, Nakornnoi et al. From the Meridol University in Thailand published the first systematic review on this exact topic. So it's an open access in BMC oral health. And this is a paper I would point any colleague to if they wanted a consensus answer. So here's how rigorous it was. 5 databases, so that was PubMed, Scopus, Embase, ProQuest, Google Scholar, and the search window from January 2000 through August 2024. And so they started with 95 articles, and they screened to 65 after removing duplicates. And then after applying strict inclusion criteria, 12 studies survived. So half were finite element studies and half were laboratory studies. And every one was assessed for risk of bias using the Cochrane-Robbins tool. And every one came back at low or moderate risk. So the conclusion was unambiguous. I'm reading the author's words now, not mine. Straight extended trim lines demonstrate superior force delivery and retention, leading to more predictable clinical outcomes. This holds across intrusion, translation, tipping, and root torquing. It holds for central incisor, the canine, and the first molar. It holds for arch expansion, and it holds for class 2 elastic mechanics. But here's where I'm going to be honest with you, because it matters here. Every single one of these 12 studies is in vitro or in silico. None of them is a randomized clinical trial. None of them measures actual treatment outcomes, like whether your patient finishes faster, needs fewer refinements, or has happier soft tissues at the end of treatment. The biomechanical case for extended is airtight. The clinical translation is still pending. And the authors are honest about this in their limitations sections. They flag the absence of PDL and saliva in lab studies. They flag the possibility of selection bias in choosing different models for FEA, and they explicitly call for longitudinal clinical trials before we treat these biomechanical findings as treatment guidelines. So if you take one thing from this systematic review, it's this: the mechanical evidence consistently favors straight extended, but the clinical evidence is forthcoming. All right, on to our last study, and here's where things gets a little bit interesting, because by the end of 2024, we have one consistent message from 12 well-designed studies: straight extended wins for force delivery. And it's synthesized in systematic review. It's confirmed across translation, intrusion, tipping, root torquing, confirmed across multiple teeth, confirmed across multiple labs. But then in 2025, this paper drops. Rugan Su and team at the Beijing Stomatological Hospital and Capital Medical University, funded by Straumann China, so same transparency pattern as we've seen before, has an open access in BMC Oral Health, and it was published November 18th, 2025. So here's the design. Patient-specific CBCT from a 25-year-old female, aligner thickness was 0.38 millimeters, 2 trim lines designed head-to-head, scalloped following the gingival contour versus a high trim line extended 2 millimeters past the gingival margin. And here's the new variable that nobody is tested for, and that's 2 intrusion protocols. They did a sequential intrusion where you intrude the central and laterals first and then the canines, versus simultaneous intrusion where you try to intrude all 6 mandibular anteriors at once. So that was 4 conditions total, and they were specifically asking for mandibular anterior intrusion in deep overbite cases. Does the consensus from the systematic review actually hold? And the drum roll is, it doesn't. For mandibular anterior intrusion, the scalloped trim line actually outperformed the high trim line on almost every measurement. Central incisor initial displacement, scalloped 1. Lateral incisor displacement, scallop delivered 50% more movement than the high trim line. Root stress, scallop produced 13 to 40% less stress than high trim line in aligners. Posterior anchorage, sequential intrusion preserved it. Simultaneous intrusion blew it up with peak PDL stress on the canines spiking 3-fold. So this is the first paper in our entire chronology where the scalloped is better than the extended design. So why? Why does mandibular intrusion break the pattern? Well, the authors give us a mechanism. When you extend the aligner 2 millimeters below the gingival margin, you create a large contact zone with the tissue. For a translation movement, like everything we've tested up to this point, that contact provides grip and improves force delivery. But for an intrusion movement, the contact zone now creates dynamic friction along the entire path of intended movement. So the aligner has to slide against the gingiva to intrude the tooth, and the longer the trim, the more friction it has to overcome. So the high trim isn't pushing the tooth down anymore, it's holding the tooth in place against itself. And the authors are honest about it. They cite Traversa 2024 directly, acknowledge the contradiction in print, and write, and I'm quoting them now, trimline gingival interactions significantly influence force transmission efficiency in multi-tooth movements. So that's not a small finding, that's a paradigm shift, because up to this point we've been answering the questions which trim line's better, and then Sue and colleagues tell us the better question is which trim line is better for this movement. And by the way, they also tested intrusion protocol. So sequential intrusion of mandibular anteriors, meaning intruding incisors first, then canines, preserved posterior anchorage. Duh. But simultaneous intrusion of all 6 incisors at once tripled the PDL stress on the canines and created measurable anchorage loss. Yeah, that makes total sense. So if you're staging an overbite case with mandibular anterior intrusion in your treatment plan, here's what the most current biomechanical evidence is telling you. Sequential, not simultaneous. Scalloped, not extended. And that's the opposite of what your default workflow probably is. Okay, so let me bring this home. At the top of this video, I promised you 3 things. Force numbers and effect sizes, we've covered all of that. Where scalloped is better than straight, we've covered that too. Mandibular anterior intrusion in deep overbite cases, right? But then the third one was the question that the research still hasn't answered, and here it is. In 13 years of biomechanical research across pressure films, finite element analysis, force simulators, all this stuff, systematic reviews, not one study has directly compared patient comfort between scalloped and straight extended trim lines in the same patients. We have force data, we have stress data, we have displacement data. We do not have patient-reported outcome data on which trim line patients actually prefer to wear. Now, that gap is closing. There's an active prospective multi-center trial. It was registered in 2025, sponsored by Dentsply Sirona using their SureSmile brand, directly comparing scalloped versus straight extended trims across multiple sites. Primary completion is estimated December of 2027, so we'll know in a couple years. So until then, here's the practical framework. For most translational, tipping, and root torquing movements, the biomechanical evidence consistently favors straight extended. But for mandibular anterior intrusion in deep overbite cases, scalloped at the gingival margin remains a legitimate evidence-supported choice. So the answer isn't universal, it depends on what movement you're prescribing and what tissue you're working with. Now, if you want to go deeper on aligner mechanics, attachment selection, case design, the full clause framework, case selection, diagnosis, I teach a complete course over at orthodonticxp.com. The link will be in the description. And if you'd like a summary paper PDF of this video, I will have a link for you there as well. So that way you can save this information for review in the future. And if you found this useful, subscribe, because every week or two, I'm breaking down another piece of clear aligner and orthodontic literature like this. So again, I'm Dr. Matthew Standridge, and I'll see you next time.